It's Paris, 1788. The price of a single loaf of bread skyrocketed to 88% of a laborer's daily wage. Not 50%, 88%. Millions are facing starvation. Yet the royal court Versailles is spending 3.6 million livres per year on Queen Marie Antoinette's private household alone. This isn't just a story about peasants storming a castle. This is the story of a national bankruptcy that led to a global explosion. To understand how guillotines replaced golden carriages, we have to follow the money. The year is 1783. France is victorious. It helped defeat Great Britain and secure American independence. But that victory cost 1.3 billion livres. This was piled on top of the 2 billion livres of debt left over from the 7 Years' War. The French state was now spending 50% of its entire national budget just to pay the interest on its loans. Another 25% went to its military. That left only 25% for everything else. The entire country, roads, administration, food supply, and the king's 34 million livre personal budget. The system was mathematically doomed. But here's where the real problem was. It wasn't just the spending, it was the income. France's tax system was built on a single, fatal flaw. The people with all the money paid nothing. The first estate, the clergy, owned 10% of all land in France. They collected 150 million livres a year in tithes, and they paid zero taxes. The second estate, the nobility, owned 25% of the land. They collected feudal dues from the peasants who worked it, and they, too, paid almost zero taxes. Who was left? The 26 million people of the third estate, the peasants, the shopkeepers, the lawyers. They paid 100% of the taille, the main land tax. They paid the gabelle, the hated salt tax. They paid the corvée, a tax paid in forced labor. A farmer earning 100 livres might pay 50 in state taxes, 14 to the church, and 14 to his feudal lord. His effective tax rate was 78%. This wasn't a government. It was an extraction machine. Several men tried to fix it. In 1776, the finance minister, Turgot, told King Louis XVI the truth. No bankruptcy, no new taxes, no new loans. He urged the king to cut spending at Versailles and taxed the nobility. He was fired in 13 months. Next came Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker. Necker did something radical. In 1781, he published the Compte Rendu, the king's first ever public budget. But he cooked the books. He hid the 1.3 billion livre American war debt and instead showed a surplus of 10 million livres. It was a lie, and it made the crisis worse when he, too, suggested taxing the nobles. He was fired. Then came Calonne. By 1786, the deficit was 112 million livres and the state was borrowing for 100 million just to stay solvent. Calonne went to the king with the last-ditch plan. Tax everyone. Tax the church. Tax the nobles. Tax the land. His proposal was put before an assembly of notables in 1787. They were, of course, the nobles and clergy he wanted to tax. They refused. Calonne was fired. The system had run out of reforms. It had run out of money. And it had run out of time. Then everything changed. In 1788, a hailstorm ripped across northern France. It was followed by the worst drought in a century. The harvest failed. The price of grain, the single most important commodity, doubled. A 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris went from 8 sous to 14.5 sous. This was the 2-minute mark. The average worker earned 15 sous a day. He now had a choice: feed himself or feed his family. But he couldn't do both. Riots over bread broke out across the country. Factories shut down, leaving 50% of the textile workforce in Paris unemployed. Economic desperation was now meeting political fury. Desperate, King Louis XVI did the one thing he hadn't done in 175 years. He called the Estates General, a meeting of all 3 estates to solve the financial crisis. It was set for May 1789. But this meeting wasn't about bread, it was about power. The core question: would they vote by order or by head? Voting by order meant the clergy first estate and nobility second estate formed a 2-to-1 block. They could veto any new tax on themselves forever. The third estate, representing 98% of France, would be powerless. Voting by head meant the Third Estate's 600 representatives could outvote the other two. The entire economic future of France hung on this one procedural question. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate made its move. They declared they were the National Assembly. They, alone, represented the people. On June 20th, the king locked them out of the meeting hall. So they gathered at a nearby tennis court, and they swore an oath. They would not leave until they had written a new constitution. This was the moment the political revolution truly began. The king's financial crisis was no longer his to control. Which brings us back to Paris. The city was a tinderbox of 600,000 people. Half of them were now unemployed. They were terrified the king was gathering troops to dissolve the new assembly. They were terrified he was hoarding grain. They needed weapons. They needed gunpowder. And they knew exactly where it was. Inside a medieval fortress prison, the Bastille. When the crowd stormed it on July 14th, they found only 7 prisoners. But they found 250 barrels of gunpowder. The symbol of revolution was, in reality, a desperate hunt for resources. In the countryside, a great fear swept the land. Peasants, starving and broke, turned on the nobles. They didn't just burn down chateaux. They burned the terriers, the feudal record books. These were the 400-year-old contracts that listed their economic obligations. They were literally burning their debts. On August 4, 1789, the National Assembly, in a single night, abolished the entire feudal system. The taille, the gabelle, the tithes, the feudal dues, the 1,000-year-old economic structure of France was gone. But this created a brand new problem. The revolution had just voluntarily destroyed 70% of its own tax revenue. It still owed 4 billion livres in debt. And now, no one would lend it a single sou. How do you run a country with zero income? A bishop named Talleyrand had an idea. The church, he argued, didn't own its 10% of France. It merely held it in trust for the nation. So, on November 2, 1789, the Assembly voted to nationalize all church lands. They seized property worth over 2 billion livres. It was the single largest wealth transfer in modern history. They didn't sell the land immediately. Instead, they used it as collateral. The government began to print paper money called assignats. Each bill was a bond supposedly backed by a piece of national property. This was meant to be a temporary solution. It became the fuel for the next 7 years of fire. At first, it worked. They paid the soldiers. They bought grain. But they owed more, so they printed more, and printed, and printed. By 1791, they had issued 1.2 billion livres in assignats. The land backing them was only being sold slowly. The paper money's value began to drop, from 100% of its face value, to 91%, to 60%. This created hyperinflation. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. A pound of sugar went from 1 livre to 60 livres. A pair of shoes went from 5 livres to 200. The government's only answer was more control. They passed the law of the maximum. It set the death penalty for speculators. Bakers who sold bread for more than the set price were dragged to the guillotine. Farmers who refused to sell their grain for worthless paper money were executed. This economic terror was the engine of the Reign of Terror. It wasn't just about political ideology. It was a desperate, violent attempt to manage a currency collapse. By 1795, the assignat was worth less than 1% of its original value. The 45 billion livres that had been printed were worthless. The government was, once again, bankrupt. The economy was destroyed. The people were exhausted. France had traded a bankrupt king for a bankrupt directory. So what happens next? When a nation's financial system completely collapses, what fills the void? A man on a horse. In 1799, a young, brilliant general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized control. His first, most crucial act wasn't winning a battle. It was economic. He abolished the assignat. He balanced the budget. He created a new, stable, gold-backed currency, the franc. He restored economic order. And in exchange, France gave him an empire. The economic cycle that began with the king's debt ended with an emperor's crown. So, which was the true catalyst for the French Revolution? Was it the political ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity? Or was it the empty stomach and the 88% bread tax? Drop your prediction in the comments and subscribe, because next month, we're going to see if this exact same economic pattern is happening again right now.